Hello there, and welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chidello.
A couple of great guests joining us by the fireside this week to talk about the state of the US economy and whether Joe Biden can start claiming a little bit more credit for it.
Yeah, we've got Betsy, Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. They're going to join us a bit later on. We're also going to get a preview of next week's extradition hearing for Julian Assange. But first...
It's now just over a week until the next and possibly last Republican presidential primary in the state of South Carolina. And Donald Trump's lead over the former governor of that state, Nikki Haley, is looking rock solid. He's 36 points up, according to a Winthrop poll this week, 35 points ahead, according to a CBS poll. Nikki Haley, meanwhile, has been stepping up her attacks on Donald Trump's mental fitness this week.
He's unhinged. He's totally unhinged.
Trump, meanwhile, has come up with a very unconvincing explanation for why he mixed up Nikki Haley and Nancy Pelosi that time. He now says he meant to do it.
I'm not a Nikki fan and I'm not a Pelosi fan. And when I purposely interposed names, they said he didn't know Pelosi from Nikki, from Tricky Nikki. He didn't know. I interposed. And they make a big deal out of it. I said, no, I think they both stink. They have something in common. They both stink.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just amazed he knows the words interposed. Yeah, Tricky Nikki, Tricky Dicky, what?
He doesn't really know the word interposed. He's using it incorrectly. But anyway, I wasn't going to go there. I didn't want to be a snob. Look, Trump obviously owns the Republican Party right now. There's no doubt about that. But this week, he tried to push it even further. Now, probably the culture war victory that Republicans are most proud of is their boycott of Bud Light beer. That's happened after Bud Light hired transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney to be their spokesperson last year. That boycott was so successful that their parent company, Anheuser-Busch, lost $400 million revenue in 3 months. That's a 10% reduction in revenue. Now, since then, Bud Light's been trying desperately to win their customers back. But conservatives are saying, not without an apology. That is until this week, when Trump called for Bud Light to get a second chance. He said Anheuser-Busch is not a woke company because they spent $700 million a year on our great farmers, because they employ 65,000 Americans, including 1,500 veterans, because they're a founding corporate partner of Folds of Honor, which provides scholarships for families and fallen servicemen and women. Oh, did I mention the Republican lobbyist for Anheuser-Busch is about to hold a fundraiser for Trump, selling tickets at up to $10,000 a head? Probably not relevant.
Sure, a coincidence.
It's about Folds of Honor, I'm sure. Anyway, that was pretty cheeky from Trump. But even cheekier, then a couple of days later, after he had personally intervened to have the head of the Republican National Committee stand down, Trump suggested that she should be replaced with a co-chair in the form of his daughter-in-law, Eric's wife, LARA Trump. Now, while LARA has no real qualifications for the job, she did promise to spend every single penny they raise in electing Donald J. Trump as president and saving America. So that's a qualification of sorts, I guess. And Trump also wants his senior campaign advisor to be the chief operating officer of the RNC as well. Now, just to be clear, the RNC is not there to elect Donald J. Trump. It is there to help all Republicans. So my question to you is Donald Trump taking too much power in the Republican Party, or is he just formalising what was informally the case anyway for the last 8 years?
Well, I mean, the timing is telling, and some would say inappropriate. We haven't had the South Carolina primary or Super Tuesday yet. Donald Trump has not got the delegates to be the Republican nominee yet. Yes, he is almost certain to be the Republican nominee, we know that. But this sort of effective melding of the RNC and the Trump operation, campaign, business, family, this amalgam of Trumpy things, that usually comes about at around the time of the nominating convention. So it's happening 4 or 5 months earlier than it traditionally would. It does help them to coordinate with fundraising. It also is useful for the Republican National Committee to know what Donald Trump thinks. So having LARA Trump in the office as a co-chair, eyes and ears for him, and able to also communicate his wishes and the campaign's wishes, the family's wishes, you could say, well, actually that makes a lot of sense. Back in the late 1980s, Maureen Reagan was appointed to the Republican National Committee as a co-chair, and it made sense because she was a conduit to President Reagan and the White House. But the downside to all of this, of course, for Republicans who are not in lockstep with Trump is, well, this means that any potential lukewarm, not so Trumpy Republicans that might be wanting to run in some of those swing districts, some of those battleground areas where you don't want to be too Trumpy if you want to win something back off the Democrats, well, they're going to be having the Trumps breathing down their necks in the RNC, making those decisions of who do we give money to have their campaign going into November.
On that note, I think one of the issues with Rhonda McDaniel is that she wasn't giving money to Trump's legal funds. So I think that might be part of what this is about. I do think you hit on the issue, though, which is, more generally than what you were saying, Congress is going to be extremely close this year, the race for Congress. The RNC plays a critical role in support for congressional races. If they're not giving enough money to Congress, then Republicans, and they're just putting it down essentially a sinkhole, billions of dollars for the presidential race, the Republicans might regret that down the road if they just lose Congress because of this.
Yeah, it is looking as though it's on a knife edge, which brings us to this week's special election in New York. The Republican Party's slim majority in the House of Representatives got even slimmer this week. Democrats did flip back that New York 3rd District in a special election. This is the one that was called after the expulsion of Republican George Santos in December. Santos, of course, accused of many things, including stealing donor funds and lying about everything from his education and his work history to his family's ethnicity. Well, the former representative for the district, Tom Suozzi, defeated the new Republican candidate, Mazie Pilip. The margin about 8 points, a few points better than polls had been predicting. This is a House district. It's an interesting one. It's got some very ritzy areas on Long Island, of Great Gatsby territory. It also takes up some upmarket suburbs, also parts of Queens as well, Donald Trump's hometown. This is Tom Suozzi's reaction after his victory was declared.
Despite all the lies about Tom Suozzi and the squad, about Tom Suozzi being the godfather of the migrant crisis, about Sanctuary Suozzi, despite the dirty tricks, despite the vaunted Nassau County Republican machine, we won.
Yeah, and it was pretty silly for the Republicans in Nassau County to be trying to tie him to the left-wing squad in Congress, because Tom Suozzi never has been left-wing. He ran a pretty conservative campaign, basically a Republican campaign on immigration and crime. Mazie Pilip, the Republican, lost despite or because of the fact that she was not a very Trumpy Republican candidate. She even had some nice things to say about Nikki Haley in the course of her campaign, and probably because of that and the fact that she has not endorsed Trump, well, Donald Trump put the boot into her.
I just watched this very foolish woman, Mazie Melissa Pilip, running a race where she didn't endorse me and tried to straddle the fence when she would have easily won if she understood anything about modern-day politics in America. MAGA, which is most of the Republican Party, stayed home, and it always will, unless it is treated with the respect that it deserves. I stayed out of the race.
And that's the kind of thing that a lot of candidates for House seats and Senate places as well come November are going to be coming up with, particularly now that the Trump family has gotten their hooks right into the RNC.
They do. He's not the only one putting the boot in. George Santos was happy to put the boot in as well. He actually set up a group text with his ex-colleagues from New York just so he could say, I hope you guys are happy with this dismal performance and the $10 million your futile bullshit cost the party. I look very much forward to seeing most of you lose due to your absolute hate-filled campaign to remove me from Congress arbitrarily. Now go tell the Republican base what you fucking idiots did, and good luck raising money next quarter. To which Congressman Andrew Garbarino replied, sorry, new phone, who dis?
Nice burn.
So George Santos looks like he's moved on nicely. Look, it's hard to know how to interpret this result. The George Santos expulsion sure didn't help the Republicans, and Santos only won in the first place after the previous guy had vacated the seat, the previous guy being Tom Suozzi. And Suozzi won by 8 points, which was the margin that Biden won this district by in 2020. And Democrats outspent Republicans $14 million to $8 million. And there was some poor weather on the day, which helps Democrats because they do more early voting. So look, there might be nothing to see here, John. But the expectations going to this primary were that the Dems were on the defensive and that there was a GOP revival happening and that the district is increasingly conservative. I could have kept on going. There are a lot of headlines. So we shouldn't forget that. What Democratic strategists like Simon Rosenberg are taking out of the win is that, according to them, immigration is not a winning electoral issue.
For most voters, there are just things that matter more than the border and immigration. It doesn't mean they're not important. It's just that the economy, healthcare, abortion rights, reproductive rights, other things matter more. And when Republicans have historically tried to turn immigration into a general election issue, they've repeatedly failed.
We'll see if he's right, because the Republicans are definitely going to try and turn immigration into an election issue. But I personally am taking something else entirely out of this result. That is that it's just one more in a long, long line of special elections that Democrats have outperformed expectations in since the Dobbs abortion ruling in 2022. Since then, Democrats have outperformed Biden's 2020 results by 4 percentage points on average in special elections. The Democrats' base, essentially these days, are what they call high-propensity voters. They are the people who show up to any old contest. It doesn't matter. So look, that's great for special elections. They'll turn up. But it doesn't necessarily translate to a high turnout general election when the other side turns up as well. One more note of caution for Democrats. CNN polling last week found that Joe Biden was actually running about 9 points behind Suozzi in that district, and he was actually trailing Trump. So it's not necessarily good news for Biden. Don't get excited about the result too much, Democrats.
Yeah, and important to note as well that Tom Suozzi was handpicked for this. There was no competitive Democratic primary, which could have come up with a more left-wing candidate who would have not been able to sell the kind of conservative anti-illegal immigration message that Suozzi was able to sell. And this district is going to be redrawn before November when the next election happens anyway. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens then. And of course, in November, New York is not a swing state. It's not highly competitive. Biden will win it by about 10 points probably, even though Trump's doing better in some state polls. But because it is not highly competitive, there won't be a big get out the vote operation. There won't be a lot of advertising. So it will be a lower turnout election for the House and Senate seats as well as a result of that. If Trump can somehow make this a competitive state, then maybe he juices a bit more turnout to help. But yeah, I think it's very, very dangerous in these cases to extrapolate too much out of one House district, except that Democrats are saying, well, if we want to win the House in November, we need to pick up about 3 of these in New York State, a few more in California, both blue states where they, if Joe Biden is doing well, they probably win the House, but may also lose the Senate.
I should also say, you mentioned the key word, which is redistricting. The New York Democrats are looking to gerrymander New York in a big way. So if they get their way, the Democrats are just going to win 4 or 5 seats just from the gerrymandering. Yeah,
well, before Tom Suozzi's win this week gave Democrats an extra vote, giving them 213 in the House of Representatives now to the Republicans 219. Speaker Mike Johnson whisked through a vote to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas at the second attempt. Last week, you recall, the vote was thwarted when the Democrats suddenly got Al Green to rise from his hospital bed to vote. Well, this time, Speaker Johnson was paying a little bit closer attention when he called this vote. 2 Democrats were missing, including Representative Judy Chu, who came down with COVID and was in isolation, and she has confirmed, yes, she would have voted against this impeachment. In the event, Johnson prevailed, but only just.
On this vote, the yeas are 214 and the nays are 213. The resolution is adopted.
So if Judy Chu hadn't had COVID, then it would have been 214 apiece and would have not gone through. So Mayorkas is now impeached, and he will be acquitted when it goes to the Senate, assuming it does, because you'd need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict. That's a very high bar. But most importantly, of course, most reasonable people think that this is an abuse of impeachment powers by the Republicans in the House to impeach a cabinet member for basically just doing their job. They say, look, if you've got differences on policy, that's fine, but it's not grounds for impeachment. But the problem is, it's kind of, well, the grounds for impeachment are pretty hazy, aren't they?
Yeah. The grounds for impeachment are high crimes and misdemeanours. What does that mean? There is no definition. It means what Congress wants it to mean. So essentially, whatever Congress says that's impeachable is impeachable. They can say whatever they want. What I would suggest, though, is if you're going to have a very low standard of impeachment, you probably shouldn't go on Fox News like French Hill, Republican French Hill just did, and say, we just did this for PR reasons.
What more do we need to say that we need to shut the border? And we know the steps to done it. We've passed them in H.R. 2. The president could take executive action to do it today. It doesn't need more money. It needs action. And this is what's disappointing to people, and that's why Mayorkas is going to pay this public relations price by being impeached.
Yeah, don't do that. The question, though, is, you already hinted at it, what does the Senate do? Because the Senate don't have to hold the trial. Just like the House can do whatever they like with impeachment, so can the Senate. The Senate can just dismiss it with a vote. The Senate can have a point of order that they say the articles are defective if they want, and that's it. The Senate can shunt it off to a committee. The Senate can do whatever they like. I guess it's a question of how much they're worried about destroying the institution.
Yeah, and we do know that Mitch McConnell sees himself as an institutionalist, and he is also somebody who can spot some leverage when he wants. The question for Speaker Mike Johnson is whether he will actually allow the House to consider the bill the Senate has just passed. This is the bipartisan foreign aid bill, providing support to Ukraine, Israel, other allies, including Taiwan. It passed the Senate by an overwhelming vote, 70-29, and Mitch McConnell has urged his party colleagues in the House of Representatives to now pass this bill.
Friends and foes alike pay close attention to what we say here and to how we vote, because American leadership matters, and it is in question.
And if Mitch is right, American leadership is in question, here may be the answer.
The Republican-led House will not be jammed or forced into passing a foreign aid bill that was opposed by most Republican senators and does nothing to secure our own border.
But of course, Chaz, that is a little bit rich, given that Republicans were the ones who first insisted that border security should be a part of this Senate bill, but then they refused to pass it until border security was stripped out. So this only became a foreign aid bill, which, if it was put to that floor vote that Mike Johnson is saying he's not going to allow as Speaker, it appears as though it would stand an extremely good chance of passing, again, with a significant bipartisan majority.
Yeah, the general view is they've got about 300 votes on the floor for this bill, and they only need 218. So they do it comfortably. But Mike Johnson has no choice. He cannot put this bill on the floor because he has been warned explicitly by members of his caucus that if he puts a bill on the floor for foreign aid, especially for Ukraine, that doesn't have immigration attached to it, they will depose him. And they have the numbers because it's so tight. So he just literally cannot afford to put that bill on the board. He just can't. There is a way around that, though. There's something called a discharge petition, where you put a bill on the floor for people to vote on around the Speaker. You work around them against their will. Now, you need a majority to do that. It's a very, very technical procedure to follow, but it can work. In fact, it's worked in the past since 1996. It's happened twice. There were two bills that have successfully been passed through discharge petition, once in 2002, once in 2015. And they do have a bill right now. They went through all the process during the debt standoff last year for a discharge petition. It's just sitting there, just ready to be used. But they need 5 Republican votes to make it live. So the question is, are they going to get those 5 Republican votes? Because the thing is, they might need more than 5 for their majority, a lot more than 5, because we don't know how many Democrats refuse to vote for this bill because it has Israel funding. There are a number of squad types who might not want to fund the war in Gaza. So every less vote on the left, they need 1 more vote on the right. So I don't know if they have the numbers for the discharge petition, but they can potentially work their way around.
Yes, and so if there is what is seen as a sort of technical parliamentary trick, a procedure that goes around Mike Johnson, it could save his speakership because, well, nothing I could do to stop it.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is they can send Judy Chu around to sneeze on Margaret Taylor Greene and they pick up a vote there, so that could work out
Quite
too.
possibly. I was going to say, though, that if 5 Republicans vote for the discharge petition, it will save Mike Johnson's job, but it'll cost them theirs.
Yeah.
Because anyone who votes for that discharge petition, they are dead to the Republican Party. I'll tell you that right now.
Although we've seen that list of House Republicans who are not standing for re-election in November get a little bit longer in the last couple of weeks, so they could be looking at, well, their next career. Maybe. Let's talk about money matters. This week, the consumer price data in the United States for the month of January came in, and it was higher than expected. It was up 0.3%, driven higher, analysts say, by housing and healthcare costs. According to Reuters, the pickup in inflation likely does not change expectations that the Federal Reserve will start cutting interest rates in the first half of this year, but analysts do now doubt that those cuts are going to start in March. That had been what the market was factoring in, and so the later in the year they start to get that interest rate relief. The later in the year, Americans who are trying to buy houses are feeling better about the economy, and that's bad news politically for Joe Biden. Yeah,
and those inflation figures you described, they spoil what was an otherwise excellent start to the year as far as the economy goes. Economic growth was 3.1% last year, higher than any single year of the Trump administration. The jobs numbers, they surprised everyone in January. They even surprised Fox News.
We're waiting on the jobs numbers where we're expecting 180,000 jobs created in the month of January and the unemployment rate to tick higher to 3.8%. We are watching the revisions, of course, and we're also looking at production. You got the numbers?
Wow.
All right, let's get right to Cheryl. Go ahead,
This is something. 353,000 non-farm jobs. I had to seriously double check this, guys.
It's hard to argue with that reaction from Fox News.
Yeah.
Real incomes, they did fall in 2022 because of inflation, but in 2023, they rebounded hard, jumping 4.2% for the year after inflation. And they grew much faster for people with lower incomes than they did for people with higher incomes. There's really been just one problem area, that's housing. Since January 2020, home prices have increased by nearly 50%, although they have fallen a little since November. Mortgage rates recently hit the highest they've been for 23 years. So that means, you put those two together, housing affordability is not great. But nevertheless, the economy is generally doing pretty well, which is why it's somewhat surprising that economic approval for Biden is mired in the low 30s, sometimes high 20s, and consumer sentiment still resembles what you would expect to see in a recession. So what's going on?
That is the $64,000 question, Chaz. On this week's Planet America, we did speak to the former Democratic Party chair and one-time presidential candidate, Howard Dean. And we asked him for his assessment about the state of the US economy and how it is going to impact this year's presidential election. Here's a little of what he had to say.
No, the economy matters the most of anything, and I think it will take some time for it to filter through. People were very scared. COVID was a terrifying event for a lot of people around the world, and I think it is going to take time to. And don't forget, prices have gone up, and they're not going to come back down again. What is going up because the job market is so tight is the ability for people to pay those prices. That takes a while to filter through. So the numbers are extraordinary in the United States in terms of job growth and in terms of purchasing power getting better. I do think we've got plenty of time for that to work its way through till Election Day.
Well, that's what a retired politician thinks. How about we talk to a couple of economists? Betsy Stevenson is a former member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and Justin Wolfers is Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan, with both at the University of New South Wales while they're in Australia. And when I say they are a couple of economists, I do mean that literally. As well as having a family together, they also collaborate on things like textbooks and other publications, which Betsy and Justin must make for some interesting kitchen table conversations as you work out your sort of family economics as well as sort of the nation's economics, which is kind of cornerstone to some of the work that you're doing as well.
The kids definitely complain about dinner time conversations becoming too economics.
When you talk about the economy as it is in the United States right now, what do you see as being the sort of the key indicators as to its current health and this whole notion that the perception is out of step with the reality?
For me, the key indicator is employment. Are people able to find work? Because work's not just important for being able to put a roof over your head and put food on the table, but it's also really important for people's identity, for their communities, for their kids. And when you lose work, it can be really hard to find work again, and people can become disconnected and depressed. It's just really hard. So for me, it's employment, and employment in the United States just looks fantastic. We have very low unemployment rate. We have growing labor force participation rate that for sort of prime age people, meaning people we expect to be working in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, those folks are working at higher rates than they were prior to the pandemic. So there's a lot of job opportunities out there, and American workers have been taking them.
Let's just add to Australia there. So, because there's a real parallel story there. The US is down near a 50-year low unemployment rate. It's at an unemployment rate, 3-point-something% that an earlier generation said we could never get to. Guess what? Australia's at or near a 50-year low unemployment rate. We have an unemployment rate of low 4, high 3 that an earlier generation of economists said we could never do. So that's the thing that made people miserable. We haven't eliminated it, but we're as low as we've been in a long, long time.
If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, one of the things we'd be talking about would be inequality. But it seems to me in the last, 15 years, certainly recently, wealth and income inequality seem to have reduced a bit, even aside from the COVID payments, the large COVID payments. Number one, why do you think that is? And number two, why hasn't anyone noticed that?
I mean, that's a really good set of questions. So, I think that we want to think about income and wealth inequality a little bit differently. With income inequality, really it seemed like coming out of COVID, we learned that if you can adopt new technology in a tight labor market, it can be adopted in a way that causes little pain and actually drives real wages up at the bottom. So I think a lot of people were worried that you'd see a whole bunch of self-checkout out kiosks being adopted in the United States, meaning that there wouldn't be these sort of low-wage service jobs for workers when they were ready to come back. But in fact, they couldn't adopt them fast enough, and workers were reluctant to come back. So what we ended up with was a lot of investment in technology that boosted the productivity of workers, and now wages at the bottom are just much higher than they were in real inflation-adjusted terms than prior to the pandemic. And that's caused something I didn't think we would necessarily see, which was wage compression, meaning wages at the bottom grew relative to wages at the top. And that's been a really important reduction in inequality, and I do think it hasn't been appropriately noticed.
Justin, with the wages situation, how far behind catching up to the inflation of the last 3 years is that right now? And is that the tipping point when it comes to consumer confidence? At what point are they not getting that bill shock at the grocery store?
Yeah, so the American story is a lot like the Australian story, which is it's a race between wages and prices. Is your paycheck going up faster than your grocery bills? And through COVID, the thing that surprised all of us was how quickly prices went up. And over the last year or so, finally, the wage line has caught up. It doesn't feel that way to a lot of people, but what we're actually seeing now is not only have wages caught up, they're starting to push a little bit ahead, which is to say that real wages, the thing that matters, your purchasing power, has been rising for about 9 months now, and it's well above the pre-COVID levels. The political problem in the United States is it doesn't feel that way. Every time you go to the grocery store, things are still a bit more expensive than what you remember. Your paycheck is big enough to offset it, but most people, when they see their paycheck go up, they think, it's because I did a good job. The boss finally rewarded and understood my genius. That was my work that pushed the wages up, and inflation stole my purchasing power. The reality is none of us are as good as we think. Our wages were largely going up to offset inflation, and they've gotten most of the way there.
The one issue with that is just Americans are not used to inflation. They're just a generation of people who've not had any experience with it. And that's true in a lot of countries, including Australia. And, at Thanksgiving, my sister-in-law looked me in the eye and she said, but the grocery prices haven't gone back down to where they were before, so it's still bad. And I was like, well, they're not going to go back down. And she was like, why? And my mother was like, well, for the same reason that I can't just pay $0.25 to go to the movies anymore. So that's actually older people who remember what the prices were, you know, in the early 50s, who are like, oh, wait, you know, when prices go up, they never come back down. But, you know, sort of younger people are like, what is this thing? Prices going up. I mean, the thing in this election is if you're looking at these key metrics, like employment, you just gave numbers, 8%. Like Biden's below 4%, right? Inflation is pretty much where it needs to be, like around that 2-3%. So if we hadn't just been through a high inflationary period, I don't think people would be all upset about where we're currently at. The key metrics point to a landslide victory by Biden. But
I mean, it's a hell of a story. You've got an incumbent, that always helps. Inflation will be down to 2 by election day. Unemployment at or near a 50-year low. Inequality declining. And he's not a lunatic.
But he's clearly not a good salesman if he's not getting credit for it.
So there is this fundamental question, which is what's going on in the U.S. economy and U.S. society that's making it so hard for people to appreciate having, let's be honest, the strongest economy in the industrialized, advanced world right now, right? You pick up the paper, Japan slipped into recession, Germany slipped into recession, Australia can't bring inflation down as fast. A lot of economies are struggling, and here's the U.S. growing faster than anyone predicted, bringing inflation down faster than anyone predicted, and keeping employment levels higher than anyone predicted, and everyone's still like, Biden's failing.
Answer the question, why?
So,
That's a good question.
You can tell by the fact she evaded it.
This is the holy grail of answering this question to the key to Biden's election. And I think that there is a deep-seated frustration and anger in the U.S. economy that makes people feel like somebody else out there is getting ahead, getting stuff that they're not getting. And what's happened is we've seen this political bifurcation in which you have the left convinced that it's all the billionaires who are with their greedflation and their, secret backdeal tax cuts, getting everything and leaving everybody else to suffer. I think you have this really lunatic fringe, big fringe, maybe even 40% fringe on the right that believes that it's like it's some sort of government swamp that is colluding to keep all the goodies for government insiders, for an Illuminati, that Illuminati's getting everything, and that's why hardworking, regular Americans, can't get ahead. But the two sides, they actually have something in common, which is they both believe that somebody else out there is getting the things that they don't deserve and preventing them from being able to get what they do deserve. And I think that's the key. And the question is, how do we change people's hearts and minds about that?
Justin, let me throw a element at you which we haven't discussed yet, which might explain at least some of the issues for at least young people, and that is housing affordability, which is quite not great at the moment. Housing prices are quite high, mortgage rates are quite high relatively to the last 20 years or so. Rents quite high, homelessness quite high. Do you think that might be having an effect, at least on young people's assessment of the economy?
No.
No? Okay.
So here's what I want you to think about. Imagine housing prices hadn't risen over the last 2 years. Just imagine it hadn't happened. I think what would happen is you would invite me onto your show and you would say, Justin, the US economy is doing well, but Biden's not getting credit. Do you think it's because house prices aren't growing? I mean, this is one of those stories that you're screwed one way and you're screwed the other way, right? Now, that's because that's the underlying economics of it. When a house price goes up, it's really bad for the person who wants to buy it, but it's really good for the person who's selling it. There's a winner and a loser in equal and opposite measure. So the part of your question that's exactly right. Why would right now young people be particularly miserable and old people particularly happy? High house prices. But that doesn't get you anywhere in terms of why would the American population as a whole be unhappy about it, because a bunch of them now have millions of dollars to retire on.
I'm going to disagree with Justin a little bit, although his point about there being two sides is really important. But I do think that young people are getting fed up with the way that U.S. society is structured to distribute all the goodies to older people. I mean, we actually do have a national healthcare system. You just have to be 65 to access it. The rest of you are screwed. But once you turn 65, we got you covered. And you know, it was actually a full national healthcare plan, and it was part of a compromise to get it passed that they dropped everybody under age 65. That's how much it's just a bifurcated system. We also have universal basic income, which we call Social Security, which means that, you know, if you're over age 65 and you've met certain minimal work requirements in your life, we're going to give you a minimum basic income that you can live off of. Oh, and also, that's the generation of people who've seen massive increases in stock market wealth, who've seen massive increases in their home price appreciation, who've locked in mortgages when they have them at 2, 3, 4%. It's also the generation that ripped apart the environment and has left us with this massive problem of climate change. But yeah, let's keep giving to them and ignore the interests of young people. I mean, I think that's how young people feel. It's like the Democrats who are supposed to be on their side, they're like, oh, pushing up against this asymmetry in the U.S. is too much. Look, I love President Biden, but what did he not get done? Not a single thing on childcare. Not a single thing on daycare, on paid leave, on the things that matter if you're trying to start a family. So you said housing. Well, you can't afford to buy a house. You can't afford to take a day off with pay if you're having a baby. What are you going to do with a baby? You can't afford daycare, childcare. And then how are you going to afford school? And then when you put them in school, they're going to get shot. It's no wonder American young people are upset.
Betsy Stevenson, Justin Wolfers, thanks for having a fireside chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, you may recall that Australian Wikileaks founder Julian Assange has a bunch of charges hanging over his head under America's Espionage Act. Those charges all stem from the collateral murder articles published in the New York Times and Guardian back in 2010. They detail the apparent war crimes being committed by Allied forces in the Iraq War. Now, WikiLeaks worked with those newspapers to get the story out, but America's been trying to prosecute Assange for those leaks ever since. The problem for Assange is that not only has he spent the last 5 years in a British jail, but a British court declared last year that he should be extradited to America, where he would face those charges, presumably. Well, next week, Assange is appealing that ruling, and to find out what exactly this means, we spoke to WikiLeaks Editor-in-Chief, Hrafnsson. Now, can you tell us what this hearing next week is all about?
Well, this is basically the last chance of Julian to get some justice in the United Kingdom after spending almost 5 years in Belmarsh prison. Next week, 2 judges will be asked to, in essence, review the denial from last summer by the High Court to Julian Assange to hear his appeal. And they will hear the arguments over 2 days next week and decide within days, hours, weeks, we don't know, whether he's going to be allowed his appeal in the High Court in London.
So, KRISTINN, what happens exactly if Julian wins? And what happens exactly if he loses?
Well, if he wins on some of the points being raised there in the appeal request, the court date will be set somewhere down the line. We have no idea how long they will take to wait for a court date to hear the actual arguments in court. And debate it. If he is denied the request to appeal, that's the end of the line. You cannot ask for a review of that in the Supreme Court. That's the end of it. And he will be extradited unless there is an intervention by the European Court of Human Rights.
Okay, so how would you describe the stakes of this hearing next week then?
Well, I mean, the stakes of this for Julian is basically distinction between life and death. It has been deemed life-threatening and is extradited. That's a medical evaluation that has not been refuted in the UK courts. He is in bad shape. If he is extradited, he will be put on trial if he survives that long in a court where there's a 100% conviction rate on espionage charges. They call it the spy court. So he has no chance of winning in that court and faces then decades in prison.
Now, you said Julian's not in good shape. A couple of years back, he seemed to be really struggling. Do you have any more detail of how he's physically holding up at this point in time?
Well, I mean, he has lost weight. He has aged a lot. He is suffering from chronic lung illnesses, and he actually fractured his ribs over frequent coughing just a few weeks ago. So he is not in a good shape, in such a shape as one could imagine after all these years and years of being locked up. And it's not just that next April is going to be 5 years in that dungeon called Belmarsh Prison, but prior to that, of course, 70 years without access to sunlight in the Ecuadorian embassy. So it's very dire.
Finally, for any supporters who might be watching, wondering if there's something they can do to help, what can they do?
It is, but I mean, the important thing now is just to show support by showing up at rallies, pressuring the politicians to step up their pressure in Australia on the US government. The support has been great by the Albanese government, but more is needed. And it is echoing the words of the Prime Minister, where he says a few months ago that he was frustrated by the lack of response to his urgent requests then for some remedy here, because enough was enough. And if that applied months ago, it applies even more now. So there has to be a general outrage, in my opinion, that this just cannot go on any longer. This has to end.
KRISTINN Hrafnsson, thanks for being with us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
Well, we are just about out of time, but before we go, let us bust some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
For any political candidate, whether they're running for president or dog catcher, getting noticed is half the challenge. Well, not so for 24-year-old Republican candidate for Missouri Secretary of State, Valentina Gomez.
This is what I will do to the growing books when I become Secretary of State.
Let's go. Welcome to the main event. Applying pressure, but I promise I ain't make it down.
These books from the Missouri Public Library. When I'm in office, they will burn.
Hope she gets a fine from that library. That ad, though, has been viewed more than 3 million times since it was posted just last week. And there has been a lot of very justified outrage. Gomez is torching books that are designed to help LGBTIQ kids understand themselves. And of course, book burning is closely associated with the Nazis in Germany, and we know what that led to. It is designed, obviously, to provoke and offend, and it comes just months after another outcry over a bunch of Missouri politicians allegedly burning books with flamethrowers.
A video showing state senators from St. Charles County using flamethrowers is drawing fire worldwide. Social media posts claim they are burning books.
But those social media posts were wrong. They were not burning books, they were burning boxes, as they say, a charity stunt.
Yet an ex-post claiming this was a book burning now has nearly 20 million views. There were no books in the boxes, and the senators say there also was no talk about the heated issue of banning books from libraries that they deemed pornographic.
So, no connection to books at all. It's a good example, though, of how overreaction online can escalate to a point where somebody like Valentina Gomez thinks it is actually a good idea to literally burn books. So, she's been noticed. The voters will now decide if she's fit to be Secretary of State. Either way, it's a bunch of malarkey, Chaz. But that's it for another Fireside Chat. We'll see you for Planet America on Wednesday night. You'll find us on iView and YouTube at 9 p.m. and on ABC TV at about 9:50 in our temporary later time slot.
And don't forget the PED podcast, where I'm going to be breaking down the special counsel report big time. It's in all the usual pod places.
Bye-bye.